Zooming or live streaming?
Live streaming. First time ever from this room. Let's hope it works. Just waving to all the fans out there.
Want me to look on my phone and see if we're coming?
That would be really nice, actually, and I'm dead serious. If you can live stream, get live stream to come up on your phone and see if it's working. Little test. That's right. We've got 1 more minute. They should be. Okay. I have 7. You ready to go? Ready to go. Good evening, guys. Welcome to Dead Guys with Dan. Our new worship pastor, Brighton Albright, is going to lead us in a hymn to get us started. So sing pretty because we're live streaming, and we want everyone out there to be able to hear your awesome voices. So come on up, Brighton.
Great. If you'll turn in a hymnal next to you to number 279. 279. You know hymnal over there? You got that down? Great. Faith of Our Fathers. Faith of our fathers living still, in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whene'er we hear that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. Verse 4. Faith of our fathers we will love, both friend and foe in all our strife, and preach thee true as love knows how, by kindly words and virtuous life. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. Y'all sound beautiful. Beautiful.
Great job. Wonderful singing. Thank you so much. If you're tuning in on live stream, welcome. You are missing out on Justin's cookies again. So thank you all for being here, and hopefully you got a chance to get some refreshments. That is one of our Dead Guys with Dan traditions, is that Justin brings the delicious snacks. And I'm glad that I don't have to, because when we were live streaming before, it was interesting. So usually on opening night, we do some review of where we've been. So I'm going to do that. Also, live streamers, my face is going to go away, and you're just going to get the slides. So I'm going to switch to that now so that we can do that. So here we go. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that okay. Good. It's working. So far, so good. So Dead Guys with Dan is just one component of a bigger men's ministry. So just to kind of advertise some of the things that we have going on, every fall semester and every spring semester, there's a 4-week study that meets on Tuesday evenings. And since I've been here in my 9th year, we've been doing church history on those, and so that's where this Dead Guys with Dan title has come from. But we also do other things like go on hikes or have men's breakfast on Saturdays, or we have a speaker and good food. There's a camp out coming up in October. Also, there are different groups meeting during the week. And so if you'd like to get into a prayer group or a discussion group or some kind of group, please just email me and I can put you in contact with folks. Those are meeting in person, but also we still have Zoom meetings going on. So that's available. Also, we have a steering committee of leaders that includes Justin Hughes and Bob Meadows and Stan Tyner and myself. So if you have any questions or whatever, you can contact us and we can let you know what's going on. So just to show you where we've been over the last several years, this is going to be our 17th installment in our series on church history. And here's the list, guys. I mean, it's tremendous. Now, if you haven't been here, that's not a problem. My promise is that these all stand on their own, and that you don't need to be along for years and years and years to make sense of what's happening. But I also put this up here to remind you that if you want any of these old materials, that you can contact me and I can hook you up with audio recordings and slides and stuff. So if there's a name on there that you're particularly interested in or an era that you're particularly interested in, just let me know and I can hook you up with that stuff. So that's there. Usually on the first night, I draw a timeline on the board and we go through 500-year hooks. We also do a church tree where I sort of show you where the major denominational branches come off the church tree. I'm going to skip that for tonight because there's so much C.S. Lewis that it's kind of packed. I don't know how I'm going to be able to do this in 4 weeks. So you can pray for me as I select material. But we're gonna jump into that. But before I do want to do some brief review of more recent church history starting in the 18th century, and just remind you that there's this pattern going on between Great Awakenings or revivals and wars. So we talked about the first Great Awakening in the 1700s with George Whitefield, John Wesley, Charles Wesley, and Jonathan Edwards. That is before the American Revolutionary War. Those are the dates for the American Revolutionary War. And then after that war, there's a second Great Awakening featuring Asbury, Finney, Palmer, and Farmer. And then the American Civil War. And then there's a third Great Awakening from the 1850s, early 1900s with D.L. Moody, Charles Spurgeon over in England. Several sessions ago, I did an intro or a flyover of the 20th century, and it's the thing that I chose. We didn't just talk about the war, but it's important to think about the 20th century being a unique century in that it's the most violent, bloodiest century known to humans. And so I put more war, more war, war, more war. So, but also in the 20th century, we traced some of the major theological movements and counter-movements. So we talked about the rise of theological liberalism. We talked about modern evangelicalism. And we did just kind of set the table for the 20th century. Because when we come to people like C.S. Lewis, both of these ideas, the wars and also the theological movements, help us make sense of his context in church history. So those things will come up as we proceed. Briefly, I always have interested readers in the room asking me what my sources are, my main sources. So what I wanted to do is show you tonight the main books that we're working through. And essentially, what you're getting is a Cliff's Notes or Sparks Notes version, at least on the front end, of this book here. This is called C.S. Lewis, A Life by Alistair McGrath. And I'm going to give this 5 stars. I highly recommend this book. It is beautifully written. It's accessible. It's well-researched. Alistair McGrath, C.S. Lewis, A Life, Eccentric Genius, Reluctant Prophet. So that's the first one. And tonight I'm going to take you through the first pretty good chunk of this. And then secondly, and I'm still working my way through this one, we have Joe Rigney, Lewis on the Christian Life. And what he's done, this is not a biography. What he's done in this book is attempt to take C.S. Lewis's writings and organize them according to the typical ways that we teach systematic theology, working through the doctrines of God, the doctrines of Christ. What does he say about salvation? What does he say about sanctification? What does he say about all of these? And it's very nicely organized, table of contents, to kind of show you how it's organized. The nice thing about this is that he shows something that if you guys have read Lewis a lot, you realize that he's not very chaotic. Actually, his theology is pretty coherent, but there's a lot, and it's in a lot of different genres. You're reading Narnia over here, you're reading a real hard essay on literature over here, but there is kind of a grand coherence in him, but it takes working through something like this to really get a grasp on that. I'm not going to take you through that as much as we're going to concentrate on the life of Lewis, but these sessions are always a combination of biography and theology. So, and we tend to be a little bit more, well, yeah, always. I tell the story of the life mostly at the beginning, and then work our way through the themes a little bit more as we've kind of got an idea of what happened in his life. So tonight's mostly story, and a couple of themes will come up that will be more important as the sessions build. Again, we're going to attempt to live stream, so if you can't make it to a session, the videos will be available. You won't even have to request them this time. You can go into the live stream section on our website and find those there if it's working. We think it's working. And then besides these two secondary works, then the primary works. So tonight, for example, there will be quotations from C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, which is his spiritual autobiography of his early life. And I'll make comments on this later this evening, but this is where especially McGrath is going to be pulling for the first part of Lewis's life from his own words. So, there we go. He starts off that book, his spiritual autobiography, by saying, I was born in the winter of 1898. His birthday is November 29th. At Belfast, in Northern Ireland, the son of a solicitor and of a clergyman's daughter. His father's name is Albert. He's a lawyer. He's very well read and has literary talent. And they even notice he was known in his law practice to be very expressive and very eloquent in his work. His mother's name was Flora. She's educated. She's talented in math, but also loved literature. And their love for books is the basis of her attraction to Albert. They're Protestant, but if you know anything about Ireland, they're living in a Catholic see. Ireland's a Catholic country. That means that they're very insulated from the culture, and mostly their friendships were with other Protestants, yet they employed a Catholic housemaid. And McGrath makes a comment about, you've heard of perhaps C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. He doesn't love denominational fighting, and he was making a comment very early on that he had a Catholic housemaid, but that does not mean that his household was without Catholic, like anti-Catholic bias. So he did grow up kind of in two ways. They had this Catholic housemaid, but also was used to the Protestant Catholic divide being very strict in his life and in the way he thought early on. He has one sibling, a brother. His name is Warren, but he goes by Warnie, and he's his best friend. He's 3 years older, and they are going to be very close. Lewis takes on the name Jack very early, from the time he's 5 years old. And this is kind of a mystery to historians. There's some theories about where this came from. One is that it came from a family pet that died named Jaxie, because his name does start as, he wants to be called Jaxie, and then Jax, and then Jack, and he sticks with this nickname his whole life. His initials, CS, stand for Clive Staples Lewis. His connection, though he's living in Ireland, his connection to Ireland is mostly to the topography, to the land itself, to the green hills, and the beauty of Ireland. He's not actually very connected to the culture. Culturally, in their home and in his life, he is essentially English. So it's interesting because his way of writing, his poetic interests are not hooked into the Irish tradition. They're coming much more from an English tradition as he goes. And he's surrounded by books. His parents love books. There were books all over the house, and they encourage him to read. And he was an early reader and read all the time. And because of this, he enjoyed rich, imaginative play with Warnie. They loved to make up worlds. And you can read from his early writings that these were called Animal World and India, and later they called it the land of Boxen, and they had these pretty elaborate worlds. Well, you can see pretty early on perhaps where the seeds from Narnia come from. This guy was making up worlds from his childhood. They're living in Ireland in a rich landscape, but you know also that one of the reasons why Ireland is so green is because of all of the precipitation. It's often cloudy, misty, raining, and so rich landscape but shrouded by mist and rain, and he's interpreting his world more through a literary lens of the books that he's reading than he is through local Irish culture. The Green Hills taught him from an early age this concept of longing. Now, that's going to be kind of a theme tonight. I hope to expand that as we go. Lewis is interested in human longing. Here's a quote from McGrath. Even at this early stage then, Lewis was probing and questioning the limits of his world. What lay beyond its horizons? Yet Lewis could not answer the questions that these longings so provocatively raised in his youthful mind. To what did these longings point? Was there a doorway somewhere? And if so, where was it to be found? And what did it lead to? Finding answer to these questions would preoccupy Lewis for the next 25 years. And so you can already, if you're thinking about the opening chapters to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you've seen the movie, you can see echoes of his own childhood. He's in a big house. There's lots of books. You can see beautiful lands outside, but through what? Rain. And we're stuck inside. And what's the doorway to those beautiful places? Could it be a magical doorway? And so this idea of longing to be beyond the hills and could you get there tends to be a theme in Lewis. So in 1905, when Jack is 7 years old, his older brother goes to boarding school in England, north of London. This is very hard on Jack because he doesn't have other playmates. And so he's kind of a lonely, introverted 7-year-old. And so even more, he finds his comfort in reading books. And he writes about this early time when Warnie is first off at boarding school about his first encounters with joy. Now, he's using joy as a kind of a big, weighty theological concept that refers to this longing that we've already been talking about. That there's this transient, which means passing and unsatisfied longing, and it's going to be a central theme of his life. He'll have these rapturous moments, almost like epiphanies or revelations, when he sees or smells a beautiful flower, and it transports him to another place. Or when he reads lines of poetry that he finds to be transcendent. And it just sort of cracks open the door for a second, but then it slams shut. And he notices this even as an early child, that there must be something more. But the door just opens and it closes so fast. And he calls that thing, that interesting thing that we're just sort of barely talking about, longing or joy. He calls it joy. In 1908, his mother, Flora, becomes terminally ill with an abdominal cancer, and she dies in August, and Lewis is only not yet 10, he's 9. And there's these sad quotes. With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. McGrath notices that there are things in The Magician's Nephew that remind him of this story. In The Magician's Nephew, Diggory Kirk's mother is lovingly described on her deathbed in terms that seem to echo Lewis's haunting memories of Flora. There she lay as he had seen her lie so many other times, propped up on the pillows with a thin, pale face that would make you cry to look at. There is little doubt, says McGrath, that this passage in The Magician's Nephew recalls Lewis's own distress at the death of his mother, especially the sight of her emaciated body in an open coffin. In allowing Diggory's mother to be cured of her terminal illness by the magic apple from Narnia, Lewis seems to be healing his own deep emotional wounds with an imaginative balm, trying to deal with what really happened by imagining what might have happened. And then there's a succession of events that's just tragic. 2 weeks after Flora's death, Albert, the husband's elder brother, Joseph, died. So he lost his mom and his uncle in quick succession. But then, in all this grief, the father sends Warnie and Jack to boarding school 2 weeks after the death of the mother. Everything that gave the young Lewis his security and identity seemed to be vanishing around him. Lewis was being sent away from Ireland, from his home, and from his books, to a strange place where he would live among strangers with his brother Warnie as his only companion. If you do read Surprised by Joy, you'll find that C.S. Lewis is extremely negative in that work about his boarding school days. He says that those days in boarding school were worse than the trenches of the Great War, and he even uses the word Belsen, an infamous Nazi concentration camp, to refer to the Malvern School, one of the schools that he attended. He absolutely hated it. Now, Warnie, when Surprised by Joy came out and he read it, said, Lewis, you're not being fair. It wasn't as bad as you have written it to be, and it was a source of tension between the brothers. Warnie believed that he significantly misrepresented the schools. Lewis himself admitted later in life that he misrepresented the school in Surprised by Joy. So I wish that I had known that when I read Surprised by Joy, because when I was reading it, I'm just reading it like I'm used to reading C.S. Lewis, sort of like soaking in every word. But later he kind of repudiates his account and says it probably wasn't as bad as it seemed. And McGrath says that even in that work and writing all that out, he's still processing his grief from his deceased mother, and he really wasn't having a pleasant experience at boarding school, and so it comes out extremely, extremely negative. And he doesn't fit in. There's a culture in the boarding schools of the games, right? And we probably, to some degrees, have experienced this. Certain schools have a sports culture, a sports-centric culture, that if you're not athletic, then you have to figure out other ways to make friends and other ways to fit in. And so for Lewis, that was hard because the games kind of ruled everything, and he would rather read and not be doing those things. So didn't fit in. That did not mean that he wasn't a good student. He excels academically, particularly in languages and literature, but he did not inherit his mother's gift for math. He struggles with math and just gets by. His brain is definitely wired for the languages and literature. More so. But one of the other things that he discovers that is a joy while he's in boarding school is the northernness. And I thought, what is this word, the northernness? And by this, he's referring to Norse mythology, the great frozen north with the beautiful Arctic sky and the northern lights. And this mythology was also captured by a book that Lewis got when he was young, Rackham's illustration, 30 illustrations, these beautiful illustrations of the Norse mythology, Vikings, but also Wagner's operas regarding the northernness. And remember that idea of transcendent joy. He in this world of mythology is finding something, a world bigger than his own world that he finds very deeply compelling, and he just loves it and kind of goes all the way in. But also, and this is negative, he realized that he was forsaking the religion of his childhood during this time in boarding school. So remember, his grandfather is a clergyman of the Church of England, and he grew up in the Church of England, was baptized in the Church of England. But by the time he's basically in upper elementary school, junior high, he is going on what he calls a slow apostasy, a drift from his faith. And one of the reasons that he cites is that if Christianity is just one of thousands of religions that are all claiming to be true, why should he believe that this one's right and the others are wrong? And that's a question, that's a perennial question. I still have students asking me this question. There's lots of religions, they're all claiming to be true. How do we know Christianity is right? And so that's one of the main reasons he finds himself kind of walking away. But he'll actually come back to this question later on. So that doesn't just go away. By the time he's 12 years old, he hates boarding school so much that he's begging his father to take him out of here. Just get me out of here. And the situation is deteriorating. The father realizes that it's time to make an important change. And so he allows him to have a private tutor. And this situation does him tremendous good. Now, the tutor isn't coming to the Lewis household. It's still a boarding school situation. But C.S. Lewis is going to go to the house of the tutor in England. And his name is Kirkpatrick, and his nickname is the Great Knock. And he's with him for these years, 1914 through 1917. And it's just tremendous. It's exactly what he needs, one-on-one homeschool situation with this brilliant tutor who is going to help him to excel. There's an interesting story about when they first meet. So I wanted to share this with you. As that is Lewis and Kirkpatrick, walk together from the train station to Kirkpatrick's house, Lewis makes this casual remark as a way of breaking the conversational ice, that the scenery in Surrey, where they are, was somewhat wilder than he had anticipated. Lewis had intended merely to begin a conversation, but Kirkpatrick seized the opportunity to begin an aggressive, interactive discussion demonstrating the virtues of the Socratic method. So let me just stop right there. The Socratic method is a teaching method that is question-driven. So you ask questions, and you keep asking questions. You lead the students in a certain way. And so here come the questions. Kirkpatrick demanded he stop talking immediately, and here come the questions. What do you mean by wildness? And what grounds had he for not expecting it? Had he studied some maps of the area? Had he read some books about it? Had he seen photographs of the landscape? Lewis conceded that he had done none of these things. His views were not based on anything. So Kirkpatrick duly informed him that he had no right to have any opinion on this matter. Now, how would you like that? Some may find this approach extremely intimidating and harsh, but Lewis loved it. It's exactly what his inquisitive, curious mind needed and wanted. He could tell that he was going to be taught by this man to think critically and well, and to live in this very stimulating way. So we're off to a good start. Kirkpatrick's ability to encourage and inspire his students became the substance of legend. And so C.S. Lewis is profoundly blessed to have a teacher like this early in his life that rescued him from who knows what as he was deteriorating in grief and in boarding school. To have such a friend and such an excellent, encouraging, and inspiring tutor will serve him his whole life. In fact, a lot of the ways that Lewis will pattern his teaching style with his students later, you can see echoes of Kirkpatrick later on. He continues to excel. Besides Greek, he's learning Latin, he's learning German, he's learning Italian. Very good with the languages. But this is the sad part, and in an increasing commitment to atheism. So though this teacher was inspiring and knew how to challenge Lewis, he was also an atheist, and so Lewis is picking up this as well from Kirkpatrick. Sad. Also around this time, we need to mention Arthur Greaves, who is someone about his age. He's actually Warnie's age, a little older. But they're friends, lifelong friends, and they exchange a lot of letters back and forth, but they also would visit each other when they could. Arthur Greaves is a Christian who also loves Norse mythology. So that was kind of one of their main connecting points early on in their friendship. He was like, you like this too, right? So Lewis writes in another place that the you too of friendship, like when you meet somebody that loves what you love, you're like, whoa, you too? That's a pretty important, common thread that brings people together, those you too moments. Well, he had that over Norse mythology with his friend Arthur Greaves. Now, Arthur Greaves is going to, in these letters, disagree with him about his atheism. And they exchange like 6 letters in a month where they're arguing back and forth, where they both just finally agree to drop it. But Arthur prays for him over the years and is a consistent witness to him through the letters over the years. And so Arthur Greaves is important to Lewis, one of his closest friends for his entire life. Now, hopefully you're already sensing the tension. You've got this guy whose brain is huge and is being trained in critical thinking and rationalism and truth and all of these things. But he's also got this love for like gods and goddesses and the frozen Arctic and flowers. And so you have his imagination and his reason at this point in his life kind of pulling him in opposite directions. But in 1916, he reads George MacDonald's Phantastes. Am I saying that correctly? Anybody want to throw out a pronunciation?
That's right.
Phantastes. Okay, going once, going twice, sold. Phantastes. And in George MacDonald, this guy writes all kinds of beautiful fiction that has a lot of lessons embedded. It's beautiful. And Lewis thinks about this early reading MacDonald as a way of baptizing his imagination. Now, that does not mean that he's a Christian at all, but it showed him that he was a really smart person who's thinking imaginatively, and he'll look back on this later like a seed is planted in the ground. Because remember, we're going in 2 different directions. Imagination's taking him this way. Reason is taking him this way. But the story of his life is going to be how those reconverge and integrate in a super deep way. And this is where a seed is planted, that he said that this will be possible. Lewis gets into Oxford University just before he has to fight in World War I. He goes to Oxford and he enters the Officers' Training Corps. He meets Edward Francis Courtenay, is easier to say Patty, that's his nickname, Patty Moore, and rooms with him while in training. So you could sort of be in kind of a cadet training corps at the university, and as your number gets called up or they deploy you, then you may be ready to be an officer, or you may just go into the enlisted on the enlisted side, depending where you are in your training. And so he's for the summer at Oxford with these other cadets. And he said there's 5 of us, and 18 months later, I'm the only survivor. So just to give you an idea, these guys all get deployed. He's the only one that survives out of his cohort, his group, his small group there at Oxford who are in the training. But this Patty Moore guy is interesting because when they're not in training, Patty's mom lives nearby, and she hosts the guys at the house. So C.S. Lewis develops a close relationship with Patty Moore's mother, Mrs. Jane King Moore, who often hosts Patty, Lewis, and their friends at her nearby home. She lives with her daughter, Maureen, and is separated from her husband. When Lewis first meets Mrs. Moore, she's 45, almost exactly the same age his mother was when she died. And the relationship accelerates, and it's complicated, and we'll continue to talk about in what ways these are complicated, but the biographer see that he kind of latches onto her in kind of this mother-son kind of way, but more than that, maybe it's a matter of historical speculation that we'll talk about a little bit. Remember, he's lost, and there's stories here this summer in Oxford of heavy drinking, sexual experimentation, some things pretty bad, increasingly friendly with Mrs. Moore. There's a mention of a pact made with Patty to look after the parent of the deceased. So he makes a deal with Patty, if I die, take care of my dad. If you die, I'll take care of your mom. That was in play. He's also wanting to write poetry. And one of the ways he's dealing with the stress of potentially being enlisted in all the horrible news of the Great War is to write poetry. And the work that he's writing in this phase is called Spirits in Bondage. McGrath says this about Lewis's aspirations. Lewis wanted to be remembered as a great poet. And he believed that he had the talent necessary to achieve this calling. However, Lewis is a failed poet who found greatness in other spheres of writing, and he'll tell that story a little bit more as we go later in his life. Yet some would say that having failed as a writer of poetry, Lewis succeeded as a writer of prose, a prose saturated with the powerful rhythms and melodious phrasing of a natural poet. So I don't know how much of this guy you've read, but if you like poetry a little bit and you like his writing, perhaps there is something to this, the poetry of his writing. He used to tell people, don't write on a typewriter. Don't write on a typewriter. Because all that incessant clacking ruins your ability to hear how the words are supposed to flow together and to sound together in their lyrical, melodious way. So he has that relationship with the words, and he couldn't quite cut it as a poet, but it made his prose a whole lot better. Now, November 29th, 1917, he arrives on his 19th birthday in the trenches near Arras in northwestern France. So, happy birthday, Mr. Lewis. You're going to war. And not just any part of the war, the most dangerous place. In all his writings, interestingly, Lewis doesn't mention the war very much. His scant references reflect the horrors of trench warfare. Things like this. He does say things like this. The horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles. The sitting or standing corpses. The landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass. So McGrath says that literature, how do you cope? Many men went insane from this, from the chaos. How does he keep his grip? And so McGrath writes about how he kind of compartmentalizes his brain and tries to stay in the books and tries to stay in the poetry and tries to keep himself sane. Literature, above all, poetry, was Lewis's firewall, keeping the chaotic and meaningless external world at a safe distance and shielding him from the existential devastation it wreaked on others. So perhaps you all have known veterans that refuse to talk about Vietnam, who refuse to talk about, if you've known some that are still living World War II, this compartmentalization where that was then, this is now, we don't go there, I can't go there. Lewis says this, I put the war on one side, like in a compartment, to a degree which some people will think shameful and some incredible. Others will call it a flight from reality. I maintain that it was rather a treaty with reality, a fixing of a frontier. And it's a way to keep sane. Patty Moore, his friend, is killed in early April. Lewis himself is wounded on April 15th, and the shell that wounded him killed the man who was standing next to him at the time. His wound is the right type of wound to allow you to go home, but doesn't make his life miserable for the rest of his life. So it's a shrapnel wound. He gets to go home, but isn't plagued by this for the rest of his life. He arrives back in England in May, and so he's back in England to recover from this, and they transfer him a few more times in his convalescence. And it's interesting, Mrs. Moore moves each time to be where he is, to follow him. He's discharged by Christmas 1918, and he gets to spend it with his father and brother, and it's a glorious reunion. Their relationships have been strained. He is going to continue to have further estrangement from his father. He's not at all happy with his closeness with Mrs. Moore, but they're glad to be together after that nightmare during Christmas 1918. And by the following month, he's back to Oxford, and he's going to remain there for the next 35 years. So what's the Oxford story? He's studying classic literature from 1919 to 1922. And he's also living what McGrath calls a double life. So he's at school, but he's also spending his afternoons and evenings with the fam, with Mrs. Moore, with Maureen, and it's having kind of a weird college experience, just hanging out with his family that isn't his family. And his father, this bothers his father, and he's increasingly alarmed by Lewis's support of Mrs. Moore. McGrath says he's living a double life because he's not letting his letters go through. So, for example, when Lewis is in Ireland visiting his father, instead of receiving his letters from Mrs. Moore at his house, he has her send the letters to Arthur Greaves' house to get his letters there. He doesn't want his dad to know. In 1919 and 20, he lives with her, and he lies to his father about how he spends his vacation. So he says that he goes on holiday with one of his buddies, but he's actually with the Moores. Now, his father arranges a visit, and Lewis scrambles to create separate living quarters in the home so that it looks like he has his own place, like he's renting a room from Mrs. Moore. And he even hires a fake roommate to pull this off. The funny thing is that when Lewis's dad gets there, he doesn't even go to the house. He just wants to go to a restaurant, and so he goes to all that trouble to, fake out his dad and keep this secret, but his dad just goes to a restaurant instead. So their relationship is complicated and estranged. In 1921, he wins an essay competition, and his essay is so good that he gets to read an excerpt from it in front of the former Prime Minister of France. It's a big deal. That essay, by the way, is lost to history. It's not preserved. We don't know what it said. He's successful academically, but there are no academic prospects for him. It's recommended to him to study English Lit, which he does in the academic year 22-23. So if you've ever been in a situation where you're about to graduate, but there weren't any job prospects, so you re-upped for another degree, that's exactly what happened here. He wants to be a professional academic. It's competitive. There are no openings. So grab on to get another degree, and maybe you'll have more chances. English literature is on the rise at this time in England, and so maybe he can have a shot teaching English Lit. So he does this. In the academic year 22-23, he crams into 9 months what normally takes 3 years to do, and he finishes this degree. He has a growing interest in Old English and medieval literature. He makes friends with Owen Barfield. This name pops up. Owen Barfield, he says, is the wisest and best of his unofficial teachers. He's particularly helpful because he demolishes Lewis's chronological snobbery. So let's start there for a second. Lewis and I are buddies. And I don't know if he's the one that first taught me this or my church history prof taught me this, but it's very common to think of the present era as the smartest era, right? Because we have the latest iPhones, we have the best technology, we have all the modern accoutrements. I mean, I pull the handle and the toilet flushes. We must be the smartest generation that has lived on the planet, right? And Lewis says that is chronological snobbery. How do you know that you're smarter than the people that came before when you're actually using their ideas all the time? You're assuming their ideas, you're applying their ideas. And so he, for the rest of his life, will recommend to people that for every living author that you read, that you should read someone dead. Because how else are you going to put pressure on the errors, the groupthink, the herding that is going on in your generation if some other generation is impressing on you, making you think in a different way? So this is very similar to the modern, idea that we can learn things from other cultures, that their perspective on a situation is something, a different way of seeing actually helps us to discover. So why wouldn't we consider that people long dead could also contribute to the modern conversation if their ideas are important enough to be true? And so that's chronological snobbery, and Barfield is the one he credits for helping Lewis see that he was a chronological snob and that it would be better for him to consider that the people that were dead weren't idiots. Also, Owen Barfield helps Lewis by critiquing sort of Lewis's just raw empiricism and materialism. Already at this point in his education, he's saying, this is all there is. And he's trying to flush the imaginative side of his life as childhood nostalgia, silly things that little boys pretend at, and that he has grown up in the world of ideas, and that we can look at these texts as interesting artifacts, but they're not actually real, right? And so Barfield pushes on that a little bit and says, how do you know? Like you experience things that your worldview isn't able to even tell you what they are. What actually is joy? What is love? What are these sort of transcendent human experiences that you have? Do you really think that they're merely glandular, like little juices in your body that give you a little squirt and now you feel happy? Maybe there's more. And so this relationship with Owen Barfield just puts a dent in his certainty with relationship to his empiricism, his materialism, his worldview, in favor of a cosmic logos, or if you want to think about a divine mind behind the universe that is actually making it an ordered place. We'll get a little bit more into that as we go. And he achieves first-class honors. So he did that course in 9 months, and he graduates at only 2 people out of the whole class receive first-class honors, and he's one of them. So he's one of the rare people who have gone through Oxford and has gotten a triple first place, because the first degree program that he took, there were 2 sections to it, and he got first place in both of those sections, but then he took on this English literature and got first place in that, so he's a triple first. He's highly qualified, highly learned, but adrift and unemployed. So again, if any of you have experienced what it's like to graduate with high honors, with beautiful things that you can frame and put on your wall, but you realize that you can't eat and you got to do something else, then that's exactly what his situation is. And he is having a very hard time figuring out how to make ends meet. His father is still supporting him, even though they are estranged, and it's pretty difficult. The story of him, wondering if he's going to get this job, and then it falling through and going to another guy. I mean, it's stressful. It was stressful to read, so I'm not going to put you through that. Eat another cookie if you want. He fills in teaching philosophy for a guy who comes over to America to do like a teaching sabbatical for a year. He fills in for that guy and is able to teach philosophy. By the way, it's helpful to know that his degree programs made him actually able to teach philosophy. So though he will tell you in his writings he's not a theologian, and he's not a theologian technically, he was pretty well trained in philosophy. And theology and philosophy overlap pretty well, which is one of the reasons why the theology that he does is actually pretty helpful. He's elected Fellow of Magdalen College's tutor in English language and literature in 1925. And this is a big deal. Like, I got a 5-year commitment from this school that I can be a tutor in English language and literature. So that's huge. He gets a stipend. He gets rooms at the college. He said he had some of the best view of Oxford. His rooms were in very well placed. And Mrs. Moore is happy because he's making money supporting this family, living in this way. He would sleep. So the rooms, when it says rooms at the university, don't really think about your professors actually having living quarters at the school. But they'd have office space, but also maybe a bedroom. Right? You can sleep there. So he would sleep there in the evenings or after. So what did the day look like? In the morning, he wakes up at the college. He's doing his work in the mornings until like 1 in the afternoon. And then he goes to the Moore's house to be with the fam from like 1 in the afternoon until 5 in the evening. Then he goes back to the school to teach for a couple more hours and then has supper at 7 p.m. and then sleeps at the school and then repeats that the next day. So that's kind of the daily rhythm. In 1929, his dad gets sick. So Lewis travels to Belfast to see him. And just to give you another just tragic quote about how bad things are with his dad, he writes this about that experience. He says, "I am attending at the almost painless sickbed of one for whom I have little affection and whose society has for many years given me much discomfort and no pleasure." And so it's just such a sad thing to read that about his relationship with his dad. Lewis decides that he's not actually sick enough to stay with him anymore. He's stable. I'm going to go back to Oxford and prepare for the fall term. So he leaves him. And then like 2 days later, he gets a brain bleed and dies. And Lewis wasn't there with him. Warney is out like in the Far East somewhere in Shanghai. And so this man died without his family around. And by the time Lewis arrives for the funeral, there's kind of a chill towards him. Like the local community just felt like, look, we know how your dad supported you, that you may be involved in shady business over there in Oxford, and you weren't even here when he died. What is your deal? Like you are kind of despicable, right? And this problem of his relationship with his dad is something that he regrets even quite a bit later in his life. So I said this already, his condition worsens and he dies. Here's McGrath saying, "Lewis unquestionably felt both pain and guilt at his father's death for much of the remainder of his life. There are hints of this at numerous points in his letters, especially in the dramatic opening sentence of a letter of March 1954, which is 25 years later, he's writing something like this. I treated my own father abominably, and no sin in my whole life seems to be so serious." And so if we had to pick one of his principal regrets, then this is among them. And I was reading this other book that I was recommending to you, the theology one, that one of the reasons, and we can kind of go around the room, and I'll give us some time to talk in a little bit. One of the reasons that people love C.S. Lewis is because he seems to write so honestly about human struggle and the human condition, because he lived it. And he lived it in ways that are shameful. And so when he talks about forgiveness, and when he's theologizing about what deep forgiveness looks like, when he talks about being forgiven of things that are despicable, he's writing about that from a pretty honest place. So if you think about him as like the prodigal son that returned, and the change that is brought upon somebody who's been through that kind of humbling, that kind of forgiveness. He writes like that, which makes him accessible. This guy's writing about how Lewis he's so interesting because he's part Kirkpatrick, and in his writing he's just like, you dummy. You feel a little slapped around by him, like he just said, that's nonsense, right? And there's just a truth telling about him, but there's also somehow this mixture of compassion and imagination that is inspiring and motivating, that doesn't make you feel like pummeled. And I think that I love that about him. I agreed right away when I read that. I'm like, yes, you're pinning something that is the kind of the feeling that you get, but you kind of connecting some dots for me personally that I really thought was pretty helpful. So the following April, Warney returns from the Far East. Remember, I didn't tell you this, but Warney's still in the military. He's doing a military career. He returns from Shanghai, and together they make one last visit to their childhood home. So their father still owned the home that they grew up in, and after he dies, the will says it goes to Lewis and to Warney. They need to go and take care of all their stuff. And so they make one last visit before it's sold, and it says this: overwhelmed by the intense stillness and utter lifelessness of the rooms, the brothers solemnly buried their toys in the vegetable patch. It was a sad and forlorn farewell to their childhood and the imaginary worlds they had once constructed and inhabited. Interesting, isn't it? You know, when Lewis writes about the grown-ups who stopped dreaming, and he himself was one who buried his toys in the ground. I just think that it's fantastic. That quote's fantastic because those things sprung up again, didn't they? They came up out of the ground and gave a world of imagination back to grown-ups who had maybe thought that that's just for little kids. And they've also given parents like a very deep literary tradition that allows them to connect with their kids and establish sort of a culture in your homes around these books. You can quote scenes and you can say, remember when Eustace got his scale scraped off? I mean, you can, if you go into this within your household, then you have it's just so ironic. This quote makes me crazy. I could just keep going, but I can't. I gotta go. Anyhow, buried the toys. In May 1930, Warney decides that he'll move in with Lewis and the Moores upon completion of his military career later that year. So Lewis says, hey, Warney, whatever you're doing after you're done in Shanghai, would you just think about joining the family? We'd love to have you. And their idea then is to pool their resources. So Lewis has a job now. Warney has military money. They also had some inheritance from the sale of the estate, and Mrs. Moore has some resources too. They're all going to pool their resources together to purchase the kilns. So if you know about C.S. Lewis, is where he'll live until he dies. 42, this house over in England, in Oxford, where they lived. And so here's where I give you guys a chance to tell us, where you've been. Anybody in this room have been there? No? Yes. Okay. Fantastic. Was it cool? Yeah. Awesome. Great. Good. So it's great. Another important friendship is J.R.R. Tolkien. We know him as writers of some of our favorite books. They first met in May of 1926, but their friendship really begins to deepen in 29. So they've met, but now Lewis's dad has died. They bought the kilns, and now his relationship is really starting to flourish with Tolkien. The relationship between Lewis and Tolkien is one of the most important of his personal and professional life. They had much in common in terms of both literary interests and shared experiences of the battlefields of the Great War. Tolkien at this time in his life needed a critical friend, one who would encourage and criticize, affirm and improve. So this guys is the best use of the term criticize. If you are an artist or you want to do great work, you love collaborating with people who can tell you what needs to be improved. Because there's a problem with your work. Once you've like looked at it too long, you can't see it anymore. And you also grow nostalgically attached to things that probably need to be cut. And so having a fresh pair of eyes, somebody who you deeply respect, somebody who knows the craft to say, actually, it would be better if we just let that one go. Or have you thought about this? And so that's, when we talk about criticize, we're not talking about negative criticism where, like, when you talk about that type of really good constructive feedback to do great work. He needed one who could encourage and criticize, affirm and improve his writing. Above all, someone who would force him to bring it to completion. So Tolkien, maybe some of you guys are like this, but he is what McGrath calls a niggling perfectionist, and he knew it. Indeed, Tolkien's late story, entitled Leaf by Niggle, which is something I've never read, which deals with a painter who can never finish his painting of a tree because of his constant desire to expand and improve it. It can be seen as a self-parodying critique of Tolkien's own difficulties in writing. Someone had to help him conquer his perfectionism, and what Tolkien needed, he found in Lewis. Man, you just gotta write it and ship it. Otherwise, it's never going to see the light of day. It is no exaggeration to say that Lewis would become the chief midwife to one of the great works of 20th century literature, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. A pretty amazing sentence. Yet, in a sense, Tolkien would also be a midwife for Lewis, because it's arguable that Tolkien removed the final obstacle that stood in Lewis's path to his rediscovery of the Christian faith. And I can't wait to tell you that story. For that, you'll either have to come back or watch on live stream, whatever you want to do. So, with our 15 minutes that we have remaining, I'll open the floor for comments. Now, the great difficulty now is to not get ahead of us. So, if you have a comment tonight about what we were talking about, like from these early years until right before his conversion, let's talk about that, because we'll save all that good stuff for next week. But some of the takeaways that I would like to offer you as you're thinking of your questions and your comments. One, if you do have a living father, that relationship is strained or difficult, then I would encourage you to pray through that and maybe get counsel about that.
Amen.
Okay, thank you. And if your father is no longer with you and you had that, then I would just extend to you that the forgiveness that Lewis was so great about talking about. Maybe it wasn't even necessarily your fault, but if you carry regret related to the kind of regret that Lewis is talking about, then I would just encourage you to latch on to the hope and the forgiveness that Lewis is also talking about. So one of the great central themes of the gospel is what Pastor Mark is preaching about right now. We are so used to thinking about the gospel as, I got a pardon from my prison sentence. He declared me not guilty. And I think that's awesome. 2 thumbs on not guilty. Way up. I love the not guilty thing that's there, and it's central. But there's also something that Pastor Mark is talking to us about, which is this reconciliation idea. Right? So we're talking about reconciliation in church right now, the ministry of reconciliation. Reconciliation means that people who are estranged come together. And the gospel is about reconciliation between humans and God, and reconciliation then, because of that, between ourselves and other humans. And it is so powerful and so miraculously powerful that it can overcome things that are impossible, that seem impossible. This gospel is that powerful and that strong. So reconciliation is a theme. Joy. And I think the joy that he's talking about will continue to expand on. But if you experience, whether it's in corporate worship, or when you're eating delicious food, or when you're looking at the or hearing the laughter of a child, or you're eating your favorite ice cream cone at Ivanhoe's, and you get those epiphanies, those little just like moments where the door just kind of opens a little bit and shuts. Though you're getting a little preview of something awful special. And that longing that we have for that is one of the central themes that is in Lewis's life. It's deeply hopeful. You can hook into that. There's a long tradition throughout church history of those transcendent moments of joy being how you can experience God. That those are like sacramental moments. And when we experience them in corporately, as a body, as a huge fellowship in church, then they're supposed to go up like another like size, right? Those are the really, really special ones. So, the theme of reconciliation, also the theme of joy, and then finally, I would just like to talk a little bit about healing from grief. Hard to imagine the kind of grief that he experienced losing his mom, and then also having to go through the horrors of war. And if the Lord can bring the kind of beauty out of ashes that he experienced, then I think that there's a lot of hope for us. What does it mean to be living in a time that we're living in? And when we talk about wasted years and we talk about things that aren't working like they're supposed to work, that the Lord is a redeeming Lord who can make beauty from ashes. So those are kind of my three takeaways. But now the floor is open for you to, make a comment. Yes.
I was sharing today with the group on this matter. You can't have reconciliation without a relationship. You have to have the vertical before you can have the horizontal. That's what the cross is all about. And we are trying to reconcile without having a relationship with God. And it's only through Him and His Holy Spirit that we're able to function on this level. So many of our relationships, we're talking about forgiveness, so many of our relationships, we try to make them work, but we are doing it, and it doesn't work. But when you get this relationship right, this happens.
Good. So the comment is that we need relationship for reconciliation. And if we're trying to reconcile without having the vertical relationship in place, then it's not going to go well. Thank you for your comment. Appreciate that. Yes, Rob.
Isn't it a great blessing that God does not always give us what we want? Lewis wanted to be a great poet. God didn't give that to him. If he had become the greatest poet of his age, no one in this room would know who C.S. Lewis was. That's just the truth. So I just think that's just an ironic example of God's mercy.
Great. Comment is, isn't it great that the Lord is merciful? He doesn't always give us what we want. That if C.S. Lewis's aspiration to become the great poet of his age were to have happened, then there's a pretty good chance that no one in this room would have ever even heard of him. So thank you. Appreciate the comment. Yeah?
Was his first tutor an atheist, or did the process they went through lead him towards atheism?
So the question is, was his first tutor an atheist, or was this process of teaching him how to do rational, critical thinking leading him to atheism? And I'm pretty sure he himself was an atheist too. Yeah. Good question.
I find that when I'm without joy and hope, it's because I've lost perspective. And perspective is a huge thing for me. If I don't have the right perspective, and the things that are going on around me dismal. It's dismal. And if I could somehow have someone come up beside me and put me in the right frame of mind so I see the larger picture, it makes a huge difference.
Wonderful comment. Dick is saying, without perspective, then we can despair. That if we can't zoom out and see the big picture, things get dismal pretty quick. Our hope goes away, our joy goes away. And so even referenced having others in his life that help him with that perspective finding task, the work of finding perspective so that we can recover joy and hope and maintain that. So thank you, Dick, for your comment. That's great.
I
Justin.
just want to build on the perspective aspect that we can't get perspective on our own lives either. You know, perspective only comes with an outside view. So we can try to broaden our scopes, but there are too many blind spots in our lives that we need others to shine light on because, you know, they're blind spots. If we could see them, they wouldn't be blind spots.
Right, so Justin's comment, building on the perspective comment, is that we have blind spots, and they're called blind spots because they're blind spots, and so we really do need others to be able to point them out, to show them to us so that we can find the perspective that we need. Thank you for your comment. That's good. Okay, anything else, guys, before we sign off for the evening? Thanks for coming out tonight. I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. So let me pray for us, and we will be on our way. Lord, we thank you so much for the work of C.S. Lewis and how he is, even from the grave, able to give us wisdom and perspective. We thank you for the ministry of reconciliation, and we pray, Lord, that you would help us to be good stewards of that in our lives, in our homes, in our extended families, in our friendships, and even broader than that, in our country. We pray for each person here that as they go, that they would be able to find worship this week, that it would help in finding the perspective that we're needing, but also those who are hearing via live stream and other means, that you would bless us as we journey together. In Jesus' name we pray, and by the Spirit. Amen.